Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the channel. I am Brian Lusk, your host. Thank you very much for joining me today. We got quite a bit that happened over the weekend, so let's go ahead and get into some of the interesting parts and see what we can find out for today. We'll start off with something pretty straightforward here, and that is this graphic right here. Good morning, Jenna. Glad to have you aboard. Thank you very much for joining me today. Let's go ahead and continue on here. This graphic right here shows how much NATO support in Ukraine has changed over the years and how really it's Russia that has been effectively driving Ukraine into NATO's hands. As it shows here, in October 2013, 66% of Ukrainians were against joining NATO. Only 20% were in favor. But around that time, that's when Russia occupied Crimea and parts of the Donbas region. So by November 2014, the numbers had flipped. 25% are against joining NATO and 51% were in favor. And by August of 2021, right before the full-scale invasion, well, the rising numbers of Ukrainians against NATO started to show that trend had reversed to a certain extent. Support for had risen a little bit as well, so 54% for, 35% against. Then, by 1 year into the full-scale invasion, this is what the numbers look like now. 86% of Ukrainians are in favor of joining NATO. 3% were against. And the thing is that this is what happens when you invade a sovereign neighbor. Why would they want to be part of your country if the only way to get you to join is to march on you and overthrow your government? That's what we're looking at here. NATO is a hedge against Russian imperialist ambitions. And the Ukrainian people as a whole seem to understand that, because that's why they support joining NATO now. Of course, when you're at war, you get pretty desperate for allies, and NATO would be a very big ally in this particular case. Next thing that kind of came across my desk when I was doing research for today was French President Emmanuel Macron, who has come up several times recently in various contexts, almost getting pretty bellicose about his rhetoric, calling for potentially troops on the ground in Ukraine, calling for stronger support, a real 180 from his prior almost tepid position, one calling for more dialogue with Russia, more negotiation with Russia. But Russia has shown that they are not really interested in dialogue unless it serves their interests, including the 7-point peace plan that Medvedev put out, which was effectively Ukraine doesn't exist anymore and it's ours. So let's look at what the Institute for the Study of War has to say. Hi, Lucille. Glad to have you on board as well. Thank you. President Macron, according to the Institute for the Study of War, underlined the necessity for European countries to continue supporting a Ukrainian victory against Russia in order to ensure Ukrainian and European security. He stated in his interview with Ukrainian TV channels that there will be no peace in Europe if Ukraine is forced to capitulate. Macron called on European countries to speed up military assistance deliveries to Ukraine and stated that a lasting peace will restore the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and guarantee the security of Ukraine and all of Europe. Macron also implied that negotiations require both Russia and Ukraine to engage in negotiations, highlighting Russia's unwillingness to engage in legitimate and good faith negotiations with Ukraine as an equal party. He also emphasized that only Russia and Ukraine can actually create a lasting peace and engage in these legitimate negotiations as the two actual people at war. So overall, Macron has really started to set the stage for Europe to get more and more involved in this war, because he recognizes that Russia's actual ambitions go far beyond the borders of Ukraine. They want to overthrow the West as being the dominant powers in the world. They want to displace the United States in particular, but Europe and the United States in general, from any kind of position of power, and instead place, well, let's go to the chase. Russia really wants to put Russia at the top of that. But the way things are going right now, Russia would end up being just a vassal state of China in a new way of looking at the world that would result in, well, China being in charge and puppet stating Russia as a result. So that's what we're looking at right there. And Macron has come to realize that. As he said, we are ready for any challenge, and if there comes another wave of escalation from Russia, we will be ready to react for the security of Ukraine and Europeans. But France will never initiate any kind of aggression. President of France, Emmanuel Macron, also said that if Moscow deviates from these red lines, then the West will not respect them either. Russia has laid out all kinds of red lines, and they've turned out to not be red lines at all, especially since they seem to really be intent on breaking all their own red lines at all in any way they can. They're not a reliable partner in negotiation for peace. Hi, Ozzy. Glad to see you on board today. We're kind of managed to get fired up by 11 a.m. my time here, which seems to be a pretty good time that's reliable most of the time. My daughter will be leaving tonight on her mission, and I've just happened to get a hole right here where I could do my do the stream here for everybody at a pretty good time. Now, Anton Herischenko gave us a pretty good summary of Emmanuel Macron's interview, talking about the role of France in the war in Ukraine is what Churchill called the nerve of war. He also said that we must bear collective responsibility. We are ready for any challenge, and if there comes another wave of escalation from Russia, we will be ready to react for the security of Ukraine and Europeans. Ukraine must have clear visibility of the military aid calendar and walk confidently up to the moment when negotiations become possible. He also talked about more aid to Ukraine, had a meeting with Scholz and the Prime Minister of Poland, Tusk, and they allocated additional finances from that meeting. He also said, interestingly, we don't have limits. We will react to how Russia reacts. I'm not going with advancing initiatives yet because this is not the spirit of collective solidarity. And he did say when he was asked about negotiating with Vladimir Putin, if Putin wants to offer something, I will answer his phone call. But the true negotiations about the end of the war must be held by Putin and Zelensky. Interesting overall speech by Emmanuel Macron in his interview, I should say. It looks like France is really trying to step up. The thing is that for a while there, it looked like Poland was going to be leading all of the European response to this. And then Poland ended up with some real trouble with probably Russian-inspired, Russian-agitated issues within their country. And then, of course, they had the election that was a real topsy-turvy moment for them. So at some point in time, somebody's going to have to step up in Europe and become the leader that is going to make the most of this moment to actually rally people around driving Russia back. And that could be Macron. Now, the big news from yesterday is this destruction of this helicopter in the Transnistria region. Now, if you pay close attention to this video and watch how things happen, I'm going to kind of give you a quick summary here. We're going to back up. This is the actual strike here. You'll see the drone come in for about 3 frames, and then it disappears. So what's up with that? I mean, you should see it go all the way to the side of the helicopter, but it doesn't. Then, of course, you see the impact itself. The supposed impact, I should say. The explosion blowing out the side of the helicopter. And then after a few moments, you see flames actually appear underneath the helicopter, almost as though it was fully fueled and ready to fly. But this helicopter, well, I'll wait on that. Let's move forward with what everybody yelled about. So when this attack took place, this was the result of it. This helicopter ended up in this destroyed state. The local Transnistrian authorities declared that this was a provocation by Ukraine, or the attack came from the direction of Ukraine, saying that they were attacking the territory of Transnistria. as Jason J. Smart provided this video from a much farther distance, saying that a Russian military helicopter in Russian-occupied Transnistria is burning. The overall result, though, is that we've got this destroyed helicopter, and with no casualties, but it had perfect quality, high-quality cameras monitoring it at the very moment of impact, which seems kind of odd because this helicopter hasn't moved since 2007. It's apparently missing windscreens and possibly other parts. It's clearly not been in functional condition for quite some time. However, that doesn't stop Russia from making the most of it. The Institute for the Study of War stated unspecified actors launched a drone at a military base in Transnistria. This was to be assessed as an ongoing. This was amidst an ongoing Kremlin hybrid operation aimed at destabilizing Moldova from within. Moldova's been having some real issues lately. They've got the Transnistria region. Obviously, they've had that one leader of the Gagauzian region, I think it is, or Gagalian, that had actually traveled to Russia and is now calling for Russia to help them out. So it's clear that the Russians have been agitating in Moldova, trying to destabilize the government and cause some real issues behind Ukraine's, basically on the backside of Ukraine. That's pretty scary stuff by itself. But as of the time that they wrote, that the Institute for the Study of War wrote this, additional information had not yet come out. In this case, the Ukrainians stated that this was a Russian provocation, that they attacked this helicopter themselves to cause fear and panic in the region. As the Ukrainians have said, they had nothing to do with it. The Transnistrians have said that the drone came from the direction of Ukraine, though they don't have any actual proof of that they're providing. They do show that this... Anton Herashchenko is theorizing, though, that this could be a casus belli, or cause for war for Russia, that might be looking for more reasons to agitate and cause issues on the backside, as I said. The fact is that Russia has every reason to do this, and Ukraine has absolutely none. It's a defunct asset. It had no military value. Even the parts were probably been pulled off that were worth having for, probably a decade ago. The thing is that other people started doing the analysis on this. Chris O states that this has the feeling of a staged attack with a disused asset. And you can see kind of here that the window is missing here, that the helicopter in the various places, like this image from 2007, you can see that exact same helicopter sitting right back here behind this one. It hasn't moved in over 15 years. So it was not a used asset. It was not militarily active. It is, however, a perfectly good target for creating an incident. And it's not one they were using, and it had no military value in its disused state. And the fact is that you would not have that sitting there with a fully fueled tank ready to drip onto the ground and light on fire underneath. So between the video where the drone disappears partway through its attack, and the way the helicopter was apparently filled with fuel, and the overall situation, it looks very much staged, at least to my eyes. I'm presenting all the information that I have been able to research on this so far so that you can make your own conclusion. Absolutely do that research, but this looks like it was an attempt at a provocation, one that may, in fact, backfire on Russia, because all of the relevant pieces of data point to this not even being a valuable asset to strike. It would be stupid to do so. Now let's continue on to some of the interesting things going on. I'm kind of putting this part in advance of the rest of the front lines section because there was so much information about what's going on over in the border regions of Russia with the Russian legions and things like that attacking into the area. The Ukrainian State Security Service reportedly conducted a series of successful drone strikes against 3 Russian oil refineries in Samara on March 16th. Now, I'm putting this in the same context because these attacks on Russian oil refineries seem to be timed with the chaos that these pro-Ukrainian Russian volunteers have been creating over in Belgorod and Kursk. So a bunch of oil refineries were attacked with drones. That's continued on. But more importantly, at least for this part here, all Russian pro-Ukrainian volunteers continue limited, let me get this a little bit bigger here, limited cross-border raids into Belgorod and Kursk oblasts. This is a continued limited military operation in these areas, and these volunteer legions have denied claims by the Russians that they have been suffering heavy losses in these raids. In fact, they have put up footage of alleged Russian prisoners of war, and they may have even captured a village. So let's go through this real quick. The one piece of information that's still kind of up in the air was this Mi-8 helicopter, or possibly a Mi-24 helicopter, that was flying from Ukraine into Belgorod and was shot down. This was an interesting situation because the initial reports that the Russian side was putting out is that this was a Ukrainian UH-60 Blackhawk. And they tried to run with that for at least 12 hours before people started looking at the details a lot more closely. In fact, they went so far. Here's War Gonzo saying that there were 20 Ukrainians on board, which I'm not even going to say what he said about it. They were flying to Kozinki to make a landing, but didn't make it. That part may be true. That's the Russian perspective. However, after the whole bit about it being supposedly a UH-60 Blackhawk came out, the Ukrainians put out this video showing their 2 Blackhawk helicopters still in perfectly good working order and still flying around normally. So they're saying we still have both of our Blackhawk helicopters. Neither one of them were involved in this incident at all. And that kind of started putting the lie to what the Russians said. Okay, hold on. That's not the right bit right there. Where is it? Bear with me a second. I've got it in here somewhere. Whoops. I've got it in here somewhere. Oh, man, I seem to have lost it. Anyway, there was a good close-up of the helicopter here that actually got shot down. And unfortunately, it seems I don't have it here. If I find it, I'll let you know. But the close-up showed a helicopter that definitely had a landing gear arrangement that was not the equivalent of what the Blackhawk has. In particular, it had a nose gear and 2 main gears. 2 main gear that it was that had actually showed quite clearly on the video and on the pictures. That's an arrangement for a Mi-24, not an arrangement for a Blackhawk, which has 2 main gear forward and 1 in the rear. So that's just, the Russians keep trying to put up whatever crazy narrative they can to try and say that the Ukrainians are losing valuable equipment. That doesn't mean that this helicopter wasn't valuable. Make no mistake about that. The real reason of showing that, trying to say that it was a Blackhawk that was doing it, was to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Ukraine, showing that U.S. equipment was being used to attack Russia itself instead of Ukrainian or Russian equipment. So that was their intention, and they're not going to get away with it. Because the facts are just the facts. Similarly, Russia has been responding with attacks on the Sumy Oblast. They've been hitting residential buildings once again. And they also hit some infrastructure, though no casualties were reported. The Ukrainians reported stopping 3 Russian saboteur groups that were advancing into the Sumy Oblast, and they say they managed to kill all the Russians and foil their attempts, and the enemy had to retreat. The thing with these reports that always bothers me is that if they found 3, how do we know there wasn't 4 or 5? And the same thing goes when it goes the other way. When the Russians claim that they have killed a sabotage group, how do we know there weren't 2 or 3? And that's what always bothers me about these reports. Budanov declared that Ukraine will continue to support anti-Kremlin militias and said that these militias were becoming a force and that Ukraine would help them in their Russian operations. That same vein, these anti-Kremlin militias claim to have captured 25 Russian troops. They did provide some video and evidence and things like that, which I don't have handy, but just know that that's what their report is. Again, these are the types of reports you have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, mainly because they're already Russians. These anti-Kremlin militias are formed up of Russians. And so therefore, finding 25 people who speak Russian would be really, really easy for them. At the end, though, I do believe they took some prisoners of war. There's enough video of that happening that it's pretty clear that these militias took some prisoners and were able to return them to Ukraine for future exchanges and things like that. They also announced that they've captured a village in the Belgorod region. Not Belgorod itself, that's a major city. They claimed that they were able to actually capture the government administration building in a small village that was right on the Ukraine border. This would be the village of Gorkovsky, and state they have full control of the village. The odds of this holding as for any length of time are not high. These are the types of raids they're going to do. Take control of a village, get the people to evacuate and panic and things like that, cause a very big splash in the media, and then eventually they're going to pull back out at some point in time. I don't see this as they don't have enough personnel and equipment to sustain that type of operation on Russian soil directly, unless they can start getting the populace on their side. In that same vein, here is a Russian tank demolishing civilian houses in the village of Kozinka, the Russian village. And I'll leave this play while I talk about it. This is interesting because it indicates that the Russians are giving up on any kind of delicate tactics in these situations. They feel like they're outmanned and outgunned enough that they have to take these drastic measures in order to prevent the Ukrainian-backed forces, these Russian militias, from advancing further into the area. So you can see the characteristic slow reverse speed of a Russian tank right there as they fire at a couple of houses and then back off. I don't know. I didn't see any indications that there was fire coming from these houses. So it could be a preemptive measure to stop the Ukrainian forces from taking those positions. But either way, this means that Russia is basically destroying their own property and infrastructure now, not just Ukraine's. There is reports that the Russians are being shelled from these two hills, from behind these two hills in Ukraine, and that's what's being the areas here are where they're firing on Russian positions in Russia itself. Interesting to see that they're actually narrowing it down to these specific places. No report yet that they've been able to stop those attacks. Gray Zone, which is Wagner affiliated, which has been rolled into the Ministry of Defense, and therefore you have to consider them effectively a Russian Ministry of Defense source at this point, took a look at this situation and talked about it for a bit. Gives a pretty good analysis of at least what the Russians believe the purpose is. They state that the enemy's goal, or the Ukrainians' goal, is to create passages in the defensive line for the advancement of the main forces. They're only working with about a company-size unit. This does not allow them to pull off full-scale maneuver, but these attacks are being accompanied by active artillery support and drone attacks. They're hitting both military positions and civilian infrastructure. This basically allows them, the Ukrainian-backed forces, to secure a numerical superiority in areas and reduce the level of protection of the defending forces of the Russian armed forces. They also, by damaging civilian infrastructure, cause panic in the rear areas. The timing, though, is what they really talk about. By timing this for the presidential election, they discredit the elections of the Russian Federation. Elections, which I might add, have their own issues that we can talk about in a little bit here. And that is the purpose of the timing of these assaults. Obviously, lots more to talk about on this, but for today, that's kind of the summary. Of course, I did mention that the Ukrainians had struck some oil facilities. Let me pull this back a little notch here. It was right in my face here. As of just yesterday, Ukraine has managed to strike yet another oil facility. They've struck multiple. In fact, I believe it's up to 13. As of this report, they stated it was 12. They're now up to 13 oil facilities that have been struck and taken from full operation to at least partial, if not offline entirely. A drone hit the Syzran oil refinery. Whoop, let me refresh this so I can get the video here. And that they've once again hit the AVT6, is what they call it. That is the distillation tower. And that is an expensive piece of kit to replace. It's mostly built with Western equipment, and therefore getting replacements for it would be a challenge, to say the least. It also basically takes the bulk of the facility offline, because the bulk of what happens is in one of those distillation towers. More talk about additional facilities being hit. President Zelensky referenced this during a recent speech, stating that these strikes reveal Russia's military vulnerabilities. Interestingly enough, for saying that the Russians are really concerned about NATO and NATO expansion, NATO attacking their country, when you actually start looking at their defenses, how they've deployed their defenses, you'll find that pretty much the things they're protecting would be Vladimir Putin's houses and only the most vital of military infrastructure. Everything else is left unprotected, as these equipment have been shoved into Ukraine or Crimea to try and protect it from other attacks on those fronts. By leaving their own territory basically unprotected, not only can Ukraine take advantage of that by throwing drones at refineries, throwing drones at whatever military facilities they can, production facilities, etc., but it shows what they truly value, at least the military leadership. And what they truly value is Putin's houses and, well, their headquarters building. It also shows they don't believe NATO is an actual threat. Otherwise, they would have heavy defenses all along the now NATO borders. Russians are now starting to talk about the issue with these attacked oil refineries a lot more seriously, and they are saying that this is showing that their protection measures are ineffective. They won't be able to do anything with these facilities as long as there's no good protection measures. And that's really what it comes down to. Here's a map of Russian refineries, with those marked in red having had a drone incident or fire just this year. Really interesting to see here, because you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that are easily 7 that could easily be struck right now, in addition to the ones that have already been struck. And there's a few more that are a little bit farther out, still potentially within that range. Crazy how vulnerable this infrastructure is. They have this huge number of refineries, and yet they are so close to Ukraine and to the West, so that makes them very vulnerable to attack. Moving on to the news out of Ukraine, and by the way, Lucille stated back when we were talking about the helicopter, Ukraine has shown no sign of being stupid. No, they've not. Desperate at times, but not stupid. Speaking of, according to the Washington Post, and I did find the actual article on this one, right now Ukraine works to shoot down 4 out of every 5 missiles fired at its cities. However, with the number of air defense missiles and equipment having reduced because they've been using them, they may only be able to target 1 in 5. And if they get to that point, they will be tremendously vulnerable in all their cities to attack by Russian forces, by Russian Shaheds, Russian ballistics, Russian air-launched cruise missiles, all of it. People, Ukrainians, that is, in Sumy Oblast, have been advised to evacuate the area, and they're gradually bringing those citizens out of the real border regions closer to the more protected areas towards the center of the country. This is really just an indication that they expect more and more attacks from Russia in this direction. Let's go ahead and move on to the news out of Russia itself. Vladimir Putin, in a recent speech, let me get this a little bit larger here, claimed that NATO military personnel are present in Ukraine and they are dying in large numbers. That is has given with no proof, as per normal, but at least that's what Vladimir Putin wants you to believe he believes. He then called for the creation of a sanitary zone in the territories subordinate to the Kiev regime. In other words, he's calling for areas to be deoccupied and everything destroyed in them that are inside of Ukraine itself. This is just exactly how they think. If they can't have it, nobody can have it. And this is just more bellicose rhetoric on the part of Vladimir Putin. From the Defense Intelligence of the UK, according to research from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, this has indicated that Russian arms exports fell by 53% between the periods of 2014 to 2018 and 2019 and 2023. As a result, Russia dropped from second to third place in the global arms export rankings, with their volumes being 52% lower in 2023 than 2022. And only 12 countries received major Russian arms in 2023, compared to 31 in 2019. They claim this is due to several factors, including Russia prioritizing equipment for operations in Ukraine, and reduced customer demand due to the risk of associated sanctions, and the global condemnation of Russia's responsibility for the war. Russia has issued a new textbook about Crimea that talks about Crimea, and it's basically chock full of propaganda, calling it, that's all there is to it, is they really just chock full of propaganda about how Crimea is Ukraine, that Crimea is Russian, and that they were forced to go and take it, etc., etc., etc. This man here is effectively a looter. He actually talks about going into Avdiivka now that the Ukrainians have fled and just stealing everything he can out of these houses, TVs, everything we don't have, he says. He says they just need a freight train to take it all out of there. So it just seems like as soon as the Russians show up, their first thought is, what can we loot from this place? What valuable things can we remove? And it seems to me there was a regime in World War II that thought much the same way. A drone struck around the Domodedovo airport in Russia that impacted a warehouse either on or near the airport facility and caused a whole lot of panic, shutting down the airport for a while. This one I had to share because it made me laugh primarily. Russian Commander Milchikov, who actually has Nazi tattoos and Nazi, as they call him, a neo-Nazi, and was part of a sabotage, assault, and reconnaissance group, has filed a lawsuit against the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs because his picture with his face was printed in a brochure about Ukrainian Nazis, claiming that he was Ukrainian, not Russian. And he was really ticked off about this. Pretty hilarious that Russia managed to find their own Nazi to put it on their brochure about Ukrainians. This, I'm not going to play the video for you, but this is basically another Russian propagandist talking about Russia's actual goals. He talks about how Russia is on an expansionist quest that reaches well beyond Ukraine. And then, of course, immediately after, the host called for a short break. Again, I just want to state it this way: when they tell you who they are, we doggone ought to believe them. And there's one thing that they have made repeatedly clear, is that they have no intentions of stopping in Ukraine itself. Then there's the big news from the weekend, and that is the Russian presidential elections over there that, of course, resulted in Vladimir Putin's big victory. There's a lot of things I've got to address in this, so I'm going to try and quickly whip through it, so bear with me as I go through that. First up is a report from The Insider stating that a Russian election official has said that they were handed envelopes with incentives for delivering favorable results. Also from The Insider, they claim a group called Golos claimed access to the internal database of the Central Election Commission, which revealed falsification of turnout in the regions, with different polling stations sending reports with the exact same data. So The Insider is claiming basically to have evidence that Russia's elections were fixed. This would not surprise any of us, but it'd be interesting to see if that actual evidence can be placed in a place where anybody can find it. Spectator Index reported that Putin's share of the vote in presidential elections has gradually climbed from 53% in 2000, 71% in 2004, 63% in 2012, now 76% in 2018, now 87% according to 2024 exit polls, which is being borne out by the rest of the results from this election. It's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin wants to be seen as being not only popular, but having a mandate to continue to carry out the things he wants to do. Grant Shapps from the UK stated that Putin has stolen another election, but he will not steal Ukraine. Here's another report on the 88% here. This came from Astra, which is a Russian language source, generally considered to be relatively neutral, though they publish perspectives from both sides. This is showing various spoiled ballots. And they've had several posts with just dozens upon dozens of these, showing people, putting peace signs all over their ballot, or otherwise writing in other things. Anything they can get to try and avoid this ballot being used for in other ways. There was actually, I mentioned this on my last video, where there was indications that disappearing ink was being used on for being handed to the people in their pens to mark their ballots. Overall, these ballots were intended to corrupt these ballots to the point where they could not be used to fake votes. However, in the end, it really doesn't matter because they don't count the votes. You can spoil all the votes you want, but when the people who count the votes are going to report what they're told, that's how it's going to come out. Overall, this is when 66% of the ballots were processed. You can see Putin had 87% of the vote, with his nearest competitors having 4% and 3% respectively. It's just straight up, this is how it works. This is how it is. They claim that the Donetsk People's Republic voted 95% in favor of Vladimir Putin, and the Luhansk People's Republic, 94%, Kherson, 88%, Yakutia, 94%, Chukotka, 90.4%, and Khabarovsk Territory at 80%. So they are claiming that Vladimir Putin is tremendously popular in occupied regions of Ukraine. Then there was this interesting Noon Against Putin campaign. This was an interesting little thing that happened mostly in foreign areas where the Russians had set up presidential election polling places in other foreign nations. And I've got right here, this is a Noon Against Putin in Yerevan. Look at the number of people that suddenly showed up at noon and lined up to vote against Putin. This was intended to show that there was a lot more people against Vladimir Putin than there were in favor. Does it pan out? I don't know. I don't know what the end result will be on this, but interesting to see nonetheless. There's videos from several other nations of showing much the same thing, of huge lines being showing up, and even some from inside Russia itself. Interesting, though, that Vladimir Putin lost to Nikolai Karentanov by a tenfold margin at one polling station in Barnaul. Could it be that there was one polling station that actually had an honest count going on? No way to tell. Arrests took place for anybody who was displaying anything that showed to be against the regime. Somebody with a t-shirt with the word Navalny written on it got arrested. 50 others at the same time. The last number I actually saw was around 80. I'm sure there were probably many more since that time. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that 99.27% of the military personnel inside the Special Military Operations Zone voted for President Putin. Sure. Of course, if you got a gun pointed at your head, you'd probably vote that way too. There was other people talking about how Vladimir Putin could not possibly have any legitimacy. Basically, he's already termed out and he's just kept on going anyway. He's rewritten the Constitution a couple of times to make sure he could stay in power. And so they're saying that really he has no legitimacy because he shouldn't be able to even be there. Of course, you thought it was bad enough when the Ministry of Defense reported 97% in favor of Putin amongst their soldiers. In Russian-occupied Chechnya, the turnout was 96% with 99.28% in favor of Putin. This is how elections happen to be carried out in Russia. You have an armed guard checking on the votes as he goes. How would you feel if that was what happened in your own polling place in the U.S. or in whatever country you're in? Would you feel like you can vote how your actual conscience? According to exit polling for people who voted abroad, though, there was actually, as of the exit poll at 1,500, Vladislav Davankov actually had the lead at 56%, with the second most popular result being invalidated ballots at 33%. With Putin himself getting 5.3%. Interesting to see that that this got arranged in such a way. Obviously, Russia's not going to report those results. Then there was the elections in Avdiivka itself. The very few remaining people who were living there were rounded up and brought over to cast their ballots. You can see armed people in the back. At least I think that's a rifle in the back. Can't tell for sure. But there's one right there for sure. So there were armed guards making sure people showed up and cast their ballots. They were also offered food for doing so. Interesting. Like buying off votes or something. More signs of arrests happening that were people were arrested as part of the voting process. Then there was this phone call that Ukraine's SBU claims to have intercepted from 2014. This is an old call that was that showed that Russia's rigging of the democratic vote for occupied Donetsk. This is about the secession vote. The key quote being, just write down 99% or something. Are you going to walk around and collect papers? Are you insane? So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at over in the elections in Russia. I'm going to take a brief break here and get a drink of water. So hang on with me for just a moment. Let's see if I can... Thank you for bearing with me for that just brief pause there. I've been trying to kind of class up those the breaks there, so where I've got a little bit of music and something interesting at least to watch while I'm doing it. I hope you guys enjoy it, at least for no other reason than just at least it's something different. Let's go ahead and go on to the international news now. Czechia is proposing an EU-wide grain import ban on Russia and Belarus. Idea being to actually stop Russia from being able to export their grain to Europe. The Czech president, Peter Pavel, there we go, said that the Kremlin has no right to set the conditions for peace in Ukraine. To be honest, as the aggressor, they really don't. The only choice they really should have is either win or walk away, and preferably prefer they just walked away. Grant Shapps was going to make a visit to Odessa, but right before he was due to leave for it, the Ukrainian intelligence operatives came over to the, at least called up the UK and said, hey, Moscow's aware of your travel plans. It means there's a leak somewhere, and somebody's going to have to plug that one. The European Union is also pressuring European importers to cut down on Russian liquid natural gas. The more they can cut away from Russia to provide that energy, the better off they'll be in the long run. Latvia has a member of parliament who's been accused of spying for Russia. And apparently this Tatiana Zdanoka, man, has been accused of spying for Russia for a very long time. The German foreign minister is trying to persuade Scholz to hand over Taurus missiles to Ukraine. This would be Annalena Baerbock. They're trying to find ways to get him to provide Taurus cruise missiles, and Scholz has been outright refusing. He's never really been clear on exactly why. The most recent was this claim that it would require German troops actually being in Ukraine to do so. Somebody else forwarded the thought that there was only one control center or control complex that could actually program the missiles, and they didn't have any redundancy. I don't know either way, but interesting. Britain is saying that Ukraine should focus their attacks on Crimea because, to a certain extent, if Russia doesn't hold Crimea, the rest of their plan pretty much ends up being worthless. Microsoft and Amazon are closing access to cloud services for Russia. Took them long enough. Then there was this headline from the Wall Street Journal who talked about the Czech Republic. The guys who are working hard to provide over 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine. You doing a special purchasing program from facilities abroad and bringing them to the Czech Republic, and then shipping them to Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal characterized them as a small ex-Soviet satellite state, which did not go over well for the members of the people, the citizens of the country. We are Czechia, a proud 10 million country whose president does phone calls with the president of Taiwan, and we just got about 1 million artillery shells to Ukrainian defenders, while Germany and France do a pissing contest over egos. It did not go over well. Interesting to see, and it's just something to watch out for. We mentioned this before, but Romania is building the largest NATO base in Europe, which is going to be larger than the Ramstein Air Base in Germany. It'll house up to 10,000 NATO soldiers. Everybody wants a little piece of NATO on their country right now. Somebody to stand there and support them if they get attacked. The Bulgarian armored personnel carriers are showing up, or at least starting to get there. These are them on the train transiting over to Ukraine. Then there's Orban, Viktor Orban. He's back at it again. He's calling on his supporters to occupy Brussels during the upcoming European election. During his speech on the occasion of the anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 against Habsburg rule, Orban compared the EU to imperial occupiers and called the Western world a source of cultural decay and destruction. There's nothing preventing Hungary from leaving the EU. The Brits did it. Hungary could do it too. They don't have to be subject to EU rules. The truth is that Hungary gets a lot of money from the EU. They don't want anything to change, except for maybe to make it so they get more money from the EU. So if they're really that intending that mad about the European Union, they ought to probably get out of the European Union. Here's a new meeting between the Russian and Serbian parliaments. Serbia has been really a problem child lately as well. The two sides have now signed a strategic partnership. North Korea launched several short-range ballistic missiles from the North Hwanghae province. Another one series of their tests going on over there. They seem to be really trying to provoke reactions now. They feel like they're not getting enough attention paid to them. Romanian President Klaus Iohannis agreed to transport weapons donated by Finland for Ukraine through Romanian territory and train Ukrainian pilots and ground personnel on the F-16. Good on Romania for putting up the extra effort on this regard. Just allowing the transit of weapons through their country makes things a lot simpler for Ukraine, gives them more options. Let's go ahead and move on to the front lines. And the updates from the last 24 hours are really interesting. Most interesting, I think, let's go ahead and grab this one here. Orlivka, there's been some pretty major changes over the last few days. Now, Orlivka is, let me get this pulled out for you, north of Donetsk area. This would be outside of Avdiivka. The changes have been primarily in these large open areas. So you'll see a lot of this is just expanding Russian control of these outer areas, which would indicate that the Ukrainian line of defense is likely this waterway right here near Semenivka. That's probably their best spot where they will be able to most effectively hold them back. Paul says the Czechs were great Soviet resistance even in the Cold War. Their history against Russian control reflects a powerful individual identity. It is total ignorance to call them small or satellite. Exactly, Paul. That is absolutely true. The fact is that the Czechs have they've got a powerful history there. They know which side their bread is buttered on. Let's continue on with the frontline updates. Let's see. Move forward again. Get to today. Now, there was some additional changes near Verbova, where Russians took another area of more open ground, is what it is overall. And as I recall, that's actually an elevated area here. Let me see if I can get out at least the satellite map here. How about the topographic map? Yeah, there's a bit of elevation right there. Not a huge change in elevation, but just a little bit higher in this area right along in here. And that means that they're advancing on the best ground available in this area. More fighting near Robotna, Verbova, and then there was this one where the deep state map has started to update the areas where the Russian legions have been moving into the areas, the Russian area. So we've got this area in Gorkovsky as being not occupied, but at least this is now a gray zone on the Russian side of the border where these legions have managed to progress. This is the area that they claim they have taken the local city hall and administration building. Over here near Kozinka and Glotovo, they're reporting that this area as well is in this gray zone, also on the Russian side of the line. It's interesting to see. In fact, if you look over here, the Novaya Tazolzanka area, there we go. This is mostly open ground, so it's not talking a major change here. And some of this may have been lingering for some time. But overall, it's clear that there are things happening across the border here. And this area right here, same thing, and Nekotayivka. These are the advances and the raids that have taken place over the last few days by these Russian legions. Those are the really big changes right there. Hi, Salim. I'm glad to have you here. Little has happened across the entire front in the last week. I've kind of showed you the changes, with things being mostly stabilized and with the Russians really not able to break through in most areas. Any changes we are seeing are usually open territory and that type of thing. That does not, however, mean that the fighting is not intense. This is a video of the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade repelling a Russian IFV push with drones and cluster munitions. There's a lot of heavy fighting going on basically all the time, all across the front, and in many areas getting hotter or colder depending on the exact moment. War Gonzo does report some changes on the front lines. The thing with the War Gonzo reports is that you got to read them with a bit of a grain of salt. They're from the Russian side entirely. They do pretty much acknowledge no real big changes, calling the advances of the Russian armed forces in the area of Verbova as minor. But overall, the Russian reports, at least from War Gonzo, are matching the information we're receiving from elsewhere, with the possible exception of the parts that were the assault, where the Russian legions are assaulting into Russia itself. The area near Krinky, this would be off the Dnipro River. Just wanted to kind of share this video showing what the area looks like now. A blasted war zone with not much standing left. It's just crazy to see. And of course, Rybar, which is another pretty much all Russian source. This is as of last night, talking about about all the drone attacks. They said that the Ukrainians attacked 8 regions of Russia at once, with the target still being oil refineries. The rest of it is pretty much along the same lines. They do talk about the fighting that's taking place on the outskirts of Kozinki. Rybar is one of the sources that actually acknowledges the ongoing presence of these Ukrainian-backed Russian legions and Russian forces into the area. And they do talk about the ongoing fighting for him. So it's clear that some sources are saying that there are no Ukrainian forces on Russian soil. Others are saying, no, this is really what's going on. There are actual fights going on here. It's going to be turmoil for a while here, so we'll just have to see how it all turns out. And that's pretty much everything directly related to Ukraine itself for today. I have a couple of extras here, not really related, just some interesting things I bumped into. There is an actual call to rename the locations in Crimea once the Ukrainians retake control, to actually restore the original Crimean Tatar names of cities and towns. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'd be really fascinated to see what that list looks like. Some imagery from the recent Steadfast Defender exercises, showing the huge amounts of military assets being used in this coordinated fashion all the way through this exercise here. If there was a coalition that could actually get themselves together to do something, this is the type of thing it would look like. Totally unrelated here. There's been an evacuation of residents in Iceland due to a volcanic eruption. Interesting to see there. I mean, it's I would not want to be in that area right now. This is the presidents of Argentina, Chile, and Brazil in the 21st century versus the 70s of the last century. Down here, you've got the classic military dictators. And up top, you've got the modern leaders of these countries, 3 lovely ladies. Then there's this dog who decided this Defense of Ukraine states, as the Best Animal Actor Role award goes to this dog. He perfectly played a role of an occupier who fights against Ukrainian drones. And finally, we've got this one. Just I had to share this one because if you watch this this tiger in a circus in Vladivostok, he is standing atop a giant globe and taking a dump. But if you pay close attention, this is North America here. North America, South America. That indicates that the area he's going to the bathroom on would be Siberia and Russia, which just made me laugh. So that's the reason why I shared that one, is that that by my remembrance of geography, that's what the tiger here is doing his business on. We'll just put it that way. And that's everything for today. Thank you very much for joining me. Glad that all of you showed up for me today, and hope that this rundown of the news really helps you out to understand what's going on in Ukraine. Obviously, some of the news is good and some of the news is bad. That is how war is. It's not going to be this. It's not always going to be good news. But in the end, this is where the most direct conflict between the West and Russia and the bad actors in the world is happening. This is, I guess, nowhere else is the good versus evil quite so clear. So that's my thoughts for today. Again, thank you for joining me. You have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.